She had 10 children, an empty stomach, and 2 days left before the cold killed them all. The town of Red Hollow watched her from behind curtained windows, not with pity, but with the particular cruelty of people who've already decided someone else's suffering is not their problem. Eleanor Voss had nothing, no roof, no food, no name worth defending anymore. And the men who took everything from her were still walking free, shaking hands at the saloon like they'd done something righteous. But one man rode in from the north, and nothing in Red Hollow would ever be the same. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Like, stay till the end, and let's find out together. The wagon wheel had cracked 3 days ago. Eleanor hadn't told the children that. She'd told them it was resting, that they'd move on soon, that things would get better. She'd said so many things over the past 2 weeks that her own voice had started to sound hollow to her, like something spoken from the bottom of a well where no one could hear the echo. The wheel wasn't resting. It was broken beyond repair, and Eleanor had known it the moment she heard the sound, that sharp wooden crack splitting the morning air like a rifle shot. She'd stood there in the mud holding baby Thomas against her chest, staring at the collapsed axle, and she had not cried. She hadn't had the luxury of crying in a long time. Red Hollow, Montana. Population 412, according to the painted sign at the edge of town, though Eleanor suspected half those people were too cowardly to count. They'd been camped at the far end of Main Street for 2 days now, just close enough to be visible, just far enough to pretend they weren't anybody's concern. The wagon sat crooked in the dirt like a wounded animal, canvas flapping in the November wind. Around it, Eleanor's children had arranged themselves in the particular way of children who have learned that stillness conserves warmth, huddled in pairs, sharing threadbare blankets, the older ones wrapping their arms around the younger ones without being asked. Clara, who was 12 and had her father's serious dark eyes, sat with 6-year-old May in her lap. 14-year-old Henry stood nearby with his arms crossed, trying to look older than he was. The twins, Bess and Ruth, age 9, hadn't separated from each other's side in 2 weeks. And somewhere in the middle of that pile of small bodies was Thomas, 4 months old, sleeping the deep, dreamless sleep of infants who don't yet understand what danger feels like. Eleanor envied him that. She stood at the edge of the wagon watching the town, watching the doors stay closed, watching the curtains shift in windows and then go still again, like eyes pretending not to see. She had already tried. The first morning, she'd walked to the general store with her chin up and Thomas on her hip, the way her mother had always told her. Chin up, Eleanor. People respect what they see. She'd asked the storekeeper, a stocky man with flour on his apron and a face like a closed fist, whether there was any work available. Cleaning, mending, anything. He'd looked at her. Then he'd looked at the children filing in behind her like a small, ragged army. "Can't help you," he'd said, and turned away. She'd tried the church. The preacher had offered a brief prayer and a half loaf of stale bread that the children tore through in under 4 minutes. She'd tried the hotel. The woman at the desk had looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, something worse than both, and said they had no positions available, sorry, dear, in a voice that made the word dear sound like an insult. By the second day, Eleanor had stopped trying the doors. She was standing behind the wagon, out of the wind, feeding Thomas from the last of the tinned milk she'd bought in the last town, when she heard footsteps on the frozen ground. Henry appeared around the canvas. He was trying to look calm, but his jaw was tight. "Ma." "I heard," she said. She had heard. The sound of boots on hard dirt, the low murmur of men's voices. 3 of them came around the side of the wagon. The one in front wore a sheriff's badge on a coat that had seen better decades. Behind him stood a heavy-set man in a banker's suit, Mr. Aldous Fitch. Eleanor had learned his name on the first day, the way you learn the names of things that can hurt you. The third man she didn't recognize. Thin, official-looking, carrying a leather satchel like he'd come from somewhere that had indoor heating and didn't miss it. "Mrs. Voss," the sheriff said. He wasn't unfriendly. That was almost worse. "Sheriff Briggs," she said, "you understand you can't keep camping here on public ground." "I understand," she said. "We'll be moving on." "Moving on where exactly?" She didn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't embarrass them both. Fitch stepped forward. He had small eyes set close together in a wide face, and he wore his authority the way some men wear their best suit, like it was the best thing about him. Mrs. Voss, the county has resources available for situations like yours. He said situations like yours, the way you'd refer to a sewage problem. The children could be placed with proper families. No. The word came out flat and absolute. Thomas stirred in her arms. Now, no one is suggesting. I know exactly what you're suggesting, Mr. Fitch. Eleanor kept her voice steady. She was proud of that. You're suggesting that 10 children are a problem best solved by scattering them across the county like seeds nobody wanted. I'm telling you no. We stay together. Fitch's small eyes narrowed. That sentiment is admirable, Mrs. Voss, but sentiment doesn't feed children. Neither does breaking up a family. The thin official man opened his satchel. Ma'am, there's paperwork. Then come back with the judge, Eleanor said. Come back with someone who has legal authority to take my children, because you're not him. And until you do, we are staying right here. There was a silence. The wind moved through it like a third opinion. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Fitch looked like a man calculating whether a fight was worth his coat getting dirty. The official man looked at his paperwork. We'll be back, Fitch said. I know you will, Eleanor said. They left. She waited until she could no longer hear their footsteps, and then she turned away from the road and pressed her forehead against the cold canvas of the wagon and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of shaking before she stopped. Henry had watched the whole thing. When she turned back around, his expression was something complicated, pride and fear in equal measure. We really moving on? He asked. I don't know, she said honestly. That was the first time she told him the truth in 2 weeks. He was old enough. She could see him absorbing it, the way young people absorb hard news, quietly, like water into stone. Where would we go? I don't know that either. Henry nodded slowly. He pulled his coat tighter and looked out at the road. Pa always said Montana was the kind of place that tested people. Your father said a lot of things. He wasn't wrong about that one. Eleanor almost smiled. Almost. No, he wasn't wrong about that one. James Voss had been dead for 3 weeks and 2 days. Fever, moving fast, the way frontier fever did. Fine on a Thursday, gone by Sunday. He'd built their ranch near Billings over 7 years, piece by piece, every board and fence post and window frame placed with his own hands. And when he died, the debts he'd kept quiet came due all at once. She hadn't known about the debts. That was the part she still couldn't make peace with. Not the grief. Grief she understood. Grief was honest. But the not knowing. James had carried it alone all those years, and he'd died still carrying it. And he'd left her holding the consequences of a secret she'd never been given the chance to help carry. The creditors came within a week. They were polite about it, which was somehow the worst part. They arrived with documents and careful language and apologetic expressions. And they took the ranch, the cattle, the horses, the tools, the winter stores, even the plow her father had given them as a wedding gift. One of them had tried to take the family Bible before Henry blocked the doorway and refused to move. They'd let that go. Small mercies. And then Eleanor had loaded her 10 children into a wagon, pointed it toward her sister's house in Helena, a 300-mile gamble on a woman she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. And she'd started driving. The wheel had cracked 40 miles from Red Hollow. She had $11 left and no one coming for her. It was Clara who saw him first. Mama. Clara's voice was different from usual. Not urgent, not frightened, but carrying a careful attention that made Eleanor look up. A rider was coming down the northern road at a steady pace, not rushing, not drifting, just moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who had somewhere specific to be. The horse was a dark bay, big-chested, suited for hard country. The man sitting her was broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy canvas coat that had been patched at both elbows, a hat pulled against the wind. He rode like someone who'd spent more time on horseback than off. He slowed as he reached the edge of town. Eleanor watched him take in the landscape, the buildings, the street, the broken wagon at the far end, and she watched the moment his attention settled and didn't move away. He turned the horse toward them. Eleanor straightened. She shifted Thomas to her left arm and pushed her hair back from her face with her free hand. A reflex, not vanity, just the instinct not to look defeated when someone was coming toward her. The man stopped his horse at a respectful distance and tilted back his hat. He had a weathered face, not old, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of lines around the eyes that come from squinting into distance and wind rather than from age. A dark beard kept short. He looked at Eleanor, then at the children arranged around the wagon, and his expression was impossible to read. "Your wheel's cracked," he said. "I know," she said. A beat. He looked at the axle. "How long you been here?" "2 days." He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment. He seemed to be thinking, which Eleanor found slightly unusual. Most men either helped or moved on. They didn't often pause to think about it first. "I'm Gideon Cross," he said. "Got a ranch about 12 miles north." He nodded in the direction he'd come from. "Was coming in for supplies." "Eleanor Voss," she said. "These are my children." He looked at them again, not the way Fitch had, assessing a problem, but the way a man looks at something that matters. Bess and Ruth were peering at him from under the canvas flap. Little May had climbed out from under Claire's arm to stand and stare. Henry watched him with careful, measuring eyes. "Where are you headed?" Gideon asked. "Helena. My sister's there." "That's a long way in a broken wagon." "I'm aware." Something almost shifted in his expression. "You got anyone helping you?" "No." He was quiet again. That same thinking quiet. The wind moved between them. Then he said, "I can fix the wheel. Got the tools at the ranch, and there's room if you need a place to stay tonight. It's nothing fancy." He said the last part quickly, like he was heading off a misunderstanding. "Just a ranch, bunkhouse, main house, couple of outbuildings. Enough room." Eleanor looked at him. She had spent the last 2 weeks measuring men, measuring their eyes, their posture, the precise angle of their discomfort around a woman with too many children and too little money. She'd gotten very good at it. Gideon Cross met her eyes and didn't look away. He didn't look apologetic. He didn't look charitable. He looked like a man asking a practical question that had a practical answer, and waiting. "Why?" she said. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because you need somewhere to go and I've got the space." He paused. "And it's November." That was all he said. Not a sermon, not a lesson, just a fact about the calendar and the cold. Eleanor looked at Henry. Henry gave her a barely perceptible nod that meant your call, but I think yes. She looked at Clara, who was already looking at her with the same expression. She looked back at Gideon Cross. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They got the wagon moving by mid-afternoon. Gideon tied it to his horse and walked alongside, steadying the cracked wheel on the rough road, and Eleanor walked with him while the older children managed the younger ones in the wagon bed. He didn't talk much. That surprised her. She'd expected questions, the kind of questions strangers feel entitled to ask when they're doing you a favor. But he just walked. He answered the few things she said, briefly and without elaboration, and offered nothing extra. After about a mile, May climbed out of the wagon and simply walked to his other side and put her small hand up toward his larger one. Eleanor tensed. She couldn't help it, waiting for him to be awkward or dismissive. He looked down at May. May looked up at him with complete solemnity. He took her hand. He didn't make a production of it, didn't comment on it or look at Eleanor for approval. He just took the small hand and kept walking, and May trotted alongside him on her short legs, and that was that. Eleanor faced forward and said nothing, but she filed it away somewhere behind her sternum, in the place where the careful things lived. The ranch appeared at dusk. First a smear of lamplight through the trees, then buildings taking shape in the failing light. The main house was low and solid, built from good timber with a covered porch along the front and smoke rising from 2 chimneys. Behind it stood a barn, a smaller bunkhouse, and various outbuildings that had the organized look of a place that worked. It wasn't pretty. Pretty wasn't a priority up here, but it was sound. "Firewood stacked on the east side," Gideon said. "Kitchen's got a stove. I'll sleep in the bunkhouse. House is yours." "We can't," Eleanor started. "I sleep in the bunkhouse in winter anyway," he said flatly. "Better insulated." He said it in a way that made it impossible to know if that was true or something he'd decided 30 seconds ago. She didn't push it. The children poured out of the wagon and stood in the yard looking at the house with expressions that cut Eleanor somewhere deep. That particular silence of people confronting the possibility of warmth after cold, food after hunger, shelter after nothing. Ruth whispered something to Bess. Bess shook her head. They stood holding hands. Henry helped the younger boys down. Clara had Thomas. "There's a pot of beans in the kitchen," Gideon said. "Made this morning, cornbread in the tin." "You live alone here?" Henry asked. "Yes." "Long time?" A pause. "Long enough." He showed them the kitchen, the fireplace, the pump for water. He showed Eleanor where the extra blankets were stored and how the temperamental latch on the back door worked. He did all of this in a flat, practical voice, like he was briefing someone on the operation of a piece of equipment, and then he went to the bunkhouse and left them to it. After the children were fed and the younger ones asleep in a pile on the floor near the fire, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with Henry and Clara. The beans were plain but hot. The cornbread was dry, but there was enough of it. Outside, the wind had picked up. "What do you think?" Clara asked quietly. "I think he's decent," Eleanor said. "He barely said 10 words, Henry said. "Some men who talk too much say nothing," Eleanor said. "He said what mattered." Henry chewed. "How long are we staying?" "Until the wheel's fixed." She looked at the table. "I'll talk to him tomorrow about how we can repay him. We're not charity cases." "Ma?" Henry looked at her. "We kind of are right now." It was a direct thing to say. Eleanor looked at her eldest son, 14 years old and already carrying the weight of someone older, and she didn't disagree. "Yes," she said, "we kind of are, but it won't be permanent." "How do you know?" She thought about it. She thought about the town of Red Hollow and the curtained windows and Aldous Fitch's small, calculating eyes and the sound of the wagon wheel cracking on a frozen road 40 miles from anywhere she belonged. "Because I won't let it be," she said. "That's the only thing I know for certain right now, so it'll have to be enough." Henry nodded. He looked back down at his food. The fire crackled. Somewhere near the barn, the horse moved in its stall. Baby Thomas made small sleeping sounds from the pile of blankets in the corner. Outside, 12 miles from the town that had wanted nothing to do with them, the Montana winter pressed against the walls of Gideon Cross's ranch house, cold and enormous and indifferent. But for the first time in 3 weeks, the walls held. The wheel took 2 days to fix. Gideon worked on it in the barn without asking for help, though Henry installed himself nearby on the first morning and watched until Gideon handed him a tool without comment and let him assist. Eleanor watched this from the kitchen window, her son and this quiet stranger bent over splintered wood in the cold, and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not quite relief. Something more cautious than that. She spent those 2 days doing what she always did when she was uncertain. She worked. She cleaned the kitchen from corner to corner. She found a loose shutter on the east side of the house and wedged it with a piece of scrap wood from the pile near the barn. She reorganized the pantry, not rearranging anything of Gideon's, just straightening what was already there. She boiled the children's clothes and hung them to dry near the fire. She kept her hands moving so her mind would have less room to circle. On the second morning, Gideon came to the kitchen door while she was making breakfast with the supplies she'd found. Dried oats, salt pork, the last of the eggs from the hens in the small coop out back. "You don't have to cook," he said. "I know," she said. "There's enough for 2 if you want to come in." He stood at the door for a moment with the particular stillness of a man deciding something, then stepped inside and sat at the table without ceremony. He ate what she put in front of him without comment, which was its own kind of compliment. No performance of gratitude, no overdone praise, just a man eating breakfast in his own kitchen. The younger children filtered in. May climbed onto the bench beside him without asking. He moved his coffee cup to make room. "We'll be done today," he said. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "And for everything else, I want to talk to you about that. What I can offer. You don't owe me anything." "I do, though. I'd like to discuss it properly." He looked at her across the table with that unreadable expression. "All right," he said. "Later." Later turned into the afternoon when the younger children were occupied and Henry was helping Gideon move the repaired wagon to the yard. Eleanor found him at the fence line, checking a loose post, and she stood on the other side of it and said what she'd been rehearsing. "I can work. We all can. The older ones are stronger than they look. Henry's a hard worker, and Claire's been running a household since she was 9. She kept her voice level. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking if there's an arrangement. Labor for room and board. Until spring, maybe, when the road's open and we can make it to Helena." Gideon listened without interrupting. He tested the fence post with both hands. "Ranch needs work," he said. "I won't pretend it doesn't." He looked at the fence line stretching out east, posts sagging, wire loose in several places. "Winter's coming in hard. I've been managing alone, but it's—" He paused, like he was deciding whether to finish. "It's a lot of ground for one person." "Then we help?" Eleanor said. "Your youngest is 4 months old." "My youngest isn't the one doing the fencing." Something moved at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "No," he said. "I suppose not." He looked at the post again. "All right, you stay. We'll figure out the work as we go." "And wages," Eleanor said. "Small ones. Whatever's fair. I'm not taking charity." He looked at her directly. "I heard you the first time." She held his gaze. "Good." That night she told the children. The younger ones took it as pure good news. Warmth and food were the only metrics that mattered at their ages. Henry was quiet for a moment, turning it over the way he did with everything. "How long's he been out here alone?" he asked. "I didn't ask," Eleanor said. "Maybe someone ought to." "Maybe," she said. "But not yet." She put the younger ones to bed and sat with Thomas for a long time in the chair by the fire, feeding him and listening to the wind and thinking about Helena and her sister Margaret, who she hadn't spoken to since an argument over something that had seemed enormous 4 years ago and now seemed like furniture in a house that had since burned down. She supposed she should send word. She supposed a lot of things. She fell asleep in this chair with Thomas on her chest, and for the first time in 3 weeks she didn't wake up until morning. That was the closest thing to peace she'd felt in a long time. The first month was hard, in the particular way that new arrangements are hard. Not because the work was more than they could manage, but because everyone was still learning the edges of each other, still figuring out where to stand and how loud to be. The children sorted themselves out faster than Eleanor expected. The ranch, for all its roughness, had a way of giving people purpose. The older boys, Henry and 13-year-old Will, who was quieter than his brother but just as capable, fell into the rhythms of the ranch work without complaint. Feeding cattle, repairing fences, carrying wood. The cold was bitter, the kind of Montana cold that gets into your joints and stays there, but the boys seemed almost to enjoy the hardness of it, like it was something to push back against. Clara managed the younger children with a seriousness that sometimes worried Eleanor and sometimes made her proud in equal measure. The twins, Bess and Ruth, became a joint force of quiet usefulness, always knowing where something was, always turning up when something needed doing. 8-year-old Sam decided within the first week that the chickens were his responsibility, and he took this seriously enough that the hens were producing better than they had before his arrival. May, who was 6 and had never met a silence she couldn't fill, appointed herself Gideon's shadow. This was not subtle. She followed him to the barn in the mornings and back to the house in the evenings, offering a running commentary on her thoughts that required no response. Gideon received this with a patience that Eleanor found quietly remarkable. He didn't talk much to May. He didn't talk much to anyone. But he listened to her in a way that was different from ignoring her, like someone listening to weather. One evening, Eleanor came to the barn to tell May supper was ready and found them both sitting on an overturned bucket and a hay bale respectively, May talking about what she planned to name every chicken, Gideon methodically oiling a leather harness. He looked up when Eleanor appeared in the doorway and said nothing, and May looked up and said, "I was just telling him about the chickens," as though this required explanation. "I heard," Eleanor said. "Come eat." Walking back to the house, May reached up and took Eleanor's hand. "He listens real good," May said. "I noticed," Eleanor said. "Better than most people." "Yes," Eleanor said, better than most people." The trouble came from town, as trouble usually did. It started as whispers. Eleanor heard the first one from the woman who ran the dry goods counter in Red Hollow, where Eleanor had gone in early December for flour and lamp oil. The woman, stout, somewhere in her 50s, with the righteously pursed lips of someone who has spent years being professionally disappointed in others, had taken Eleanor's money and made change, and then said, as Eleanor was picking up her parcel, "You're the one staying out at Cross's place." "That's right," Eleanor said. "With your children." "Yes." The woman looked at her with an expression that managed to be both pitying and accusatory at the same time. "You know how that looks," she said. Eleanor picked up her parcel. I know how feeding 10 children looks, she said. It looks necessary. She walked out, but she'd heard the tone in the woman's voice, and she recognized it. The particular frequency of a rumor already in motion, already past the point where the truth had any particular relevance. She didn't say anything to Gideon about it that day or the next, but by the end of the week, Henry came home from the trading post where he'd gone with Gideon for nails and wire and said quietly, while they were alone in the kitchen, the men at the trading post were talking. About us? About Ma living with an unmarried man. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. Gideon heard it too. He didn't say anything. Eleanor stirred the pot. Neither should you. I know, I just thought you should know. I knew, she said. She'd known since the dry goods counter. She'd known the way women who've survived small towns always know. Not from direct evidence, but from the particular shift in the air around them, the way conversations stopped and restarted, the way people's eyes moved a half-second too late. A week before Christmas, Aldous Fitch rode out to the ranch. He didn't come alone. He brought the thin official man, whose name, Eleanor learned, was Peabody, from the County Family Services office, and a third man she'd never seen, who turned out to be the county judge's clerk. They arrived at mid-morning when Gideon was out on the north pasture and Eleanor was alone with Clara and the younger children. She met them at the door. Fitch had practiced his expression on the ride over. Concerned, regretful, reasonable. It sat on his face like a hat that didn't quite fit. Mrs. Voss, he said, we've had reports of concern from members of the community regarding the welfare of your children. Reports from whom? Concerned citizens. Name one. Fitch's practiced expression flickered. This is an official inquiry, Mrs. Voss. Mr. Peabody here represents the county office, and he has the authority to assess— Assess what? Eleanor said. Come in then. Look around. My children are fed and clothed and doing schoolwork at that table right now. She stepped back from the doorway and let them see past her into the kitchen, where Clara had the younger ones seated with slates, and Sam was bent over a reading primer, and May was copying letters with her tongue between her teeth. You tell me what exactly concerns you. Peabody stepped forward, his leather satchel clutched to his chest. He had the hunted look of a man who had taken this job believing it was about helping people and had since discovered it was mostly about standing in doorways feeling uncomfortable. Ma'am, our concern is about the moral environment, he said. The children are residing in a household with an unmarried man who is not their father or any relation, and the community has raised— The community, Eleanor said, watched my children sleep in the dirt for 2 days in November, and not one of them opened a door. So the community can keep its opinions about my children's welfare. Peabody blinked. Fitch stepped in. Be that as it may, Mrs. Voss, there is a legal question here about suitable guardianship. I am their mother, Eleanor said. That is the most suitable guardianship there is. In a stable environment. This is a stable environment. It has a roof, walls, heat, food, and 10 children who are doing better than they were 5 weeks ago. She kept her voice flat, hard, like a door being held shut. Now, you want to do this properly? Bring the judge. Bring him out here and let him see what's in front of him rather than listening to Aldous Fitch's opinions about other people's lives. She looked at Fitch steadily. I know what this is about. I owe no one in this county anything, and I'm not giving you my children to satisfy a gossip. There was a silence. The clerk, who hadn't spoken, had been writing something. He stopped writing. Fitch's face was red. It was the red of a man who was angry, but also, Eleanor suspected, not entirely sure he had solid legal ground under his feet. You'll be hearing from the judge's office, he said. I expect I will, Eleanor said. Good day. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a long moment. In the kitchen, Claire had quietly moved the children's attention back to their work, but Eleanor could see from the set of her 12-year-old daughter's shoulders that she'd heard every word. Mama? May said. Who were those men? Nobody important, Clara said before Eleanor could answer. Keep practicing your letters. Eleanor walked to the stove and put water on for coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. They weren't shaking. She checked because she wanted to know. They weren't, but they were close. Gideon came back at midday, and she told him straight. She laid it out factually, beginning to end, while she poured the coffee. He listened from his side of the table with his hands around the mug and his face doing nothing readable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You handled it," he said. "I told them to bring a judge, and they will." He looked at his coffee. "Fitch doesn't let things go. He's been wanting this land for 2 years. Anything that looks like instability out here?" He stopped, seemed to reconsider what he was saying. "He'll use whatever he can find." "So this isn't just about me," Eleanor said. "Doesn't mean it isn't also about you." He paused again. "I'm sorry. I should have thought about how it looked. You and the children being here. You were trying to help. Doesn't mean it was smart." He said it flatly, not as self-pity, just fact. "I should have thought further ahead." Eleanor looked at him. He was staring at the table with the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head, calculating costs and paths the way you'd plan a route across uncertain terrain. "What happens if they take the children?" Henry asked. He'd come in quietly and was standing in the doorway, and neither of them had noticed. Eleanor started to speak, but Gideon answered first. "They won't," he said. "How do you know?" Gideon looked at Henry directly. The boy held his gaze. "Because your mother will fight it," Gideon said. "And I'll back her up. That's how." Henry looked at his mother, then back at Gideon, measuring something. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, at least partially. He gave a short nod and went back to the other room. Eleanor and Gideon sat in the kitchen for a while longer, the cold pressing against the windows, the stove ticking with heat. "The judge's hearing," she said finally. "When do you think they'll schedule it? January, maybe? February?" He looked at her. "We'll need to show them a functioning household, not a—" he searched for the word. "Not a situation." "It is a functioning household," Eleanor said. "I know that," he said. "We'll need them to know it too." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Sam making his rounds among the chickens, his breath a small cloud in the cold air. Ruth and Bess were hauling water from the pump, taking turns on the handle. The ranch looked exactly like what it was. A hard-working household full of children who were doing their jobs and not falling apart. And if Aldous Fitch and a room full of county officials needed to see that in order to believe it, then Eleanor would stand there and let them look at every inch of it until they had no argument left. She had been left with nothing before and built something from it. She could do it again. "We should write to the judge directly," she said. "Before they schedule the hearing, get our account of things in first." Gideon looked at her with something that was either surprise or approval. It was hard to tell with him. "Can you write it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I can write it." She pulled a piece of paper from the shelf and set it on the table and began. The fire in the stove kept burning. The children kept working. The wind kept moving across the Montana plains like it had been moving for centuries before any of them arrived, and would keep moving long after. And in a ranch house 12 miles north of Red Hollow, Eleanor Voss wrote her case in plain, careful language and did not soften a single word. The letter reached the judge's office on a Tuesday. Eleanor knew because Gideon rode into town that morning and came back in the afternoon with confirmation from the post clerk that it had been received. He said this at the kitchen table without particular ceremony, the same way he reported most things. The fence on the north line was repaired. The east pasture was showing ice. The letter had been received. Facts placed on the table like tools, each one with a specific use. Eleanor thanked him and went back to the bread she was kneading and tried to feel something solid in that information. It helped. Not much, but some. Christmas came and went quietly. Eleanor had nothing to give the children and said so honestly, and they had taken it with a grace that made her chest hurt. The younger ones because they didn't fully understand, the older ones because they did, and had decided not to make it worse. Henry had carved a small horse from a piece of scrap wood and given it to May. Clara had braided Ruth and Bess's hair with a piece of red ribbon she'd been saving since October. Sam had presented Thomas solemnly with a chicken feather, which Thomas received with the enthusiasm only a 4-month-old can bring to a chicken feather. Gideon had disappeared into the barn that morning and come back an hour later with a wooden box he'd built during the evenings of the previous week, divided into small compartments, sized for children's things, small treasures, whatever they had. He set it down in the main room without announcement. "For keeping things," he said. Will, who was 13 and not easily impressed, ran his hand along the wood and said, "That's good joinery." He said it with the authority of a boy who had watched his father build things for years, and it was meant as a real compliment, and from the slight shift in Gideon's expression, he understood it that way. That was Christmas. The reply from the judge's office arrived in the second week of January. It was not the reply Eleanor had hoped for. The hearing was scheduled for the third week of February. That part was expected. What was not expected was the language, formal, bureaucratic, stripped of all ambiguity, stating that the county had filed a formal petition regarding the welfare of the Voss children, citing unsuitable domestic arrangements and lack of established legal guardianship, and that both parties were required to present before the Honorable Judge Warren Cale in the Red Hollow Courthouse. Peabody's name was on the filing. Fitch's fingerprints were all over it. Eleanor read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then put it down flat on the wood and pressed both palms against it as though she could push it back into nothing. "They filed formally," she said when Gideon came in that evening. He took the letter and read it. He read it slowly, which she'd noticed was how he did most things. Not because he was slow, but because he was thorough. When he set it down, he didn't say anything for a moment. "Unsuitable domestic arrangements," he finally said. "Yes?" "Because you and the children are living in my house, and I'm not your husband. That appears to be the legal argument." He was quiet again. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. From the other room came the low murmur of Clara reading aloud to the younger children, something she did most evenings. Whatever book or pamphlet or page she could find, her voice steady and patient. "There's a solution," Gideon said. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the table. Not at her. At the table. In the way of a man who has thought something through to its logical end and doesn't particularly enjoy where it arrived, but isn't going to pretend it didn't. "If you were my wife," he said, "legally, on paper, the county's argument falls apart. Unsuitable domestic arrangement becomes a married household. The petition loses its foundation." He paused. "The children would have legal standing, a named guardian. Fitch wouldn't have anything left to pull on." Eleanor sat very still. I'm not talking about..." He stopped. Started again. "It would be a legal arrangement. Protection. That's all I'm offering. You'd have your own room. Nothing would change." She looked at him for a long time. He finally looked up and met her eyes and held them, and she saw in his face something she'd rarely seen there. Uncertainty. Not weakness, just the plain human uncertainty of a man who has said a thing he can't unsay and doesn't know how it lands. "You'd do that," she said. "Legally bind yourself to a woman with 10 children you've known for 6 weeks. 7 weeks, he said, as if the correction mattered. "Gideon." "The land," he said. "The children. Fitch wants both. He's been after this ranch for 2 years, and your situation handed him a lever he thinks he can use. If we take that lever away," he shook his head, "I'm not going to sit here and watch him use your children to get what he's after." Eleanor stood up from the table and walked to the window. The yard was dark, the outlines of the barn and the bunkhouse just visible against the lighter darkness of the snow. She stood there looking out at the nothing of a Montana January night, and she thought about James, who had kept secrets to protect her and managed only to leave her unprotected. She thought about the courthouse. She thought about Peabody's leather satchel and Fitch's small eyes. She thought about May and Thomas and Sam and all the rest of them, sleeping 10 feet away from this conversation in blissful ignorance. "I would want to contribute," she said to the window, "properly. Not as someone who was rescued. An equal part of this household." "That's what you already are," Gideon said. She turned from the window. "You're sure about this?" "I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't. It'll change things. It'll change what people in town can do to us," he said. "Rest of it is up to us." He said us without hesitation, like it was a word he'd already decided on. Eleanor looked at him, this quiet, careful man who had ridden in from the north one November afternoon and taken a 6-year-old's hand and fixed a wagon wheel and never once asked her what she could give him in return, who slept in a bunkhouse so her children could have a house, who built a box with compartments because children needed somewhere to keep their small things. "All right," she said. "Yes." He nodded once. He looked briefly like a man who had expected to have to argue longer and wasn't sure what to do with the extra time. He picked up the letter from the table and folded it. I'll ride to the pastor's tomorrow, he said. See about the paperwork. Gideon, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. I know what this costs you. He considered this for a moment. I know what it costs you too, he said. And that was all. They were married on a Thursday, the 15th of January, in the front room of the ranch house during the first real snowfall of deep winter. There was no celebration, no guests, no flowers, no music. The circuit preacher was a thin, tired man named Tillman who'd been riding between homesteads for 22 years and had the particular matter-of-fact manner of someone who'd learned that frontier ceremonies were mostly about the paperwork. He read the words. Gideon said yes in a flat, clear voice. Eleanor said yes in a voice that was steady because she made it steady. Tillman signed the document. Eleanor and Gideon signed it. Henry and Clara witnessed. The younger children watched from the doorway with varying degrees of understanding. Sam asked Will in a whisper if this meant Gideon was their father now. Will whispered back that he didn't know. May watched with enormous solemn eyes and said nothing, which was notable enough that Eleanor caught it and filed it away. Afterward, Tillman drank a cup of coffee, said he hoped the weather held, and rode back toward town. The snow kept falling, thick and soft, piling up along the fence lines. Gideon went to check on the cattle. Eleanor stood in the front room for a moment after everyone else had drifted away. The document was on the table. Eleanor Cross, it said in Tillman's handwriting, née Voss. And she looked at it with a feeling she couldn't have accurately described, which was somewhere between grief and relief and a third thing that didn't have a clean name. She picked up the document, folded it carefully, and put it in the wooden box Gideon had made. Then she went to start dinner. In the weeks between the wedding and the hearing, the ranch ran itself with the particular intensity of a household that knows it is being watched and refuses to give anyone anything worth seeing. Eleanor kept the house. The children kept their routines. Gideon ran the ranch the way he always had, steadily without drama, from before dawn until after dark. But things had shifted, in the small ways that things shift when a formal arrangement becomes something you live inside of every day. He was in the house more. He ate every meal at the table now, rather than sometimes taking his food to the bunkhouse. He and Henry had started talking in the evenings about the spring plans for the ranch, which pastures to rotate, where the fence needed rebuilding from the ground up, what they'd need to order before the thaw. He talked to Henry the way you talk to someone whose opinion matters, and Henry received this with the careful seriousness of a boy who was very aware he was being treated as something more than a boy. Clara, who was sharp and missed very little, watched all of this from whatever corner she was occupying and occasionally looked at Eleanor with an expression that was more knowing than a 12-year-old had any business having. One evening, Eleanor caught her looking. "What?" Eleanor said. "Nothing," Clara said, with the particular tone that meant the opposite. "Clara," her daughter looked at her book. "He fixed the loose board on the porch steps," she said. "He didn't say anything about it. He just fixed it." "I noticed," Eleanor said. "Pa used to leave things like that for weeks." Clara said it carefully, not as a criticism, just a comparison. "I'm just saying." Eleanor didn't answer. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed an answer. She had noticed the steps. She'd noticed other things too. The way he'd taken Thomas from her arms one morning without asking when she had both hands full and couldn't manage the door, just lifted him with the particular matter-of-fact competence of someone who'd decided this was a thing that needed doing. The way he'd looked at Thomas afterward, briefly, before handing him back, with an expression Eleanor hadn't been meant to see. She didn't say anything about those things. She just kept moving, kept working, kept putting one day behind another. February was coming, and she had a courthouse to survive first. The night it all broke open was not the courthouse. It came 3 weeks before the hearing, on a Tuesday, without any warning at all. Thomas got sick. It started in the afternoon, a fussiness that Eleanor initially read as hunger, then as gas, then, by the time the sun went down, as something worse. His temperature came up fast, the way infant fevers did, and by 9 o'clock he was burning and limp and making small sounds that Eleanor had never heard from him before. And those sounds woke something cold and wordless inside her chest that no amount of competence could push back down. She did what she knew: cool cloths, boiled water. She'd dealt with sick children before. 10 children meant 10 rounds of croup and colic and the usual fevers. She knew what she was doing. But Thomas was 4 months old and his temperature wasn't coming down, and his breathing had a quality she didn't like. A shallow, rapid thing that scared her more than the fever itself. Clara sat with the other children in the back room and kept them quiet. Henry had come to the doorway once, and Eleanor had looked at him and said, "Go back to bed," in a voice that made him go. She didn't call for Gideon. She didn't think about him, really. She was too deep inside the work of trying to cool an infant who wasn't cooperating with her efforts, talking to Thomas in a low, continuous murmur. Not words exactly, just sound, the way you talk to something small and frightened to let it know it's not alone. She heard the door. She didn't look up. Footsteps crossed the floor behind her, and she expected it to be Henry, coming back despite being told not to, and she started to say his name. "What do you need?" Gideon said. His voice was quiet, steady. Not asking whether help was needed, not asking if he should stay. Just asking what she needed and standing there ready to receive the answer. She told him. She told him in clipped, efficient sentences, cold water, keep it coming. The cloth needed changing every few minutes. She needed 2 hands free to hold Thomas still and couldn't manage the basin at the same time. She told him, and he moved immediately to do it, filling the basin at the pump, bringing the water, exchanging the cloth with the particular focused calm of someone who had shut off everything that wasn't useful. They worked through the night that way. The fever didn't break until nearly 3 in the morning. It broke the way fevers break, not all at once, but in stages. Thomas's small body gradually releasing the heat it had been holding, his breathing evening out, his hands unclenching from the tight fists he'd made. By 4 o'clock, he was cooler and quieter and had fallen into an actual sleep rather than the terrible half-conscious state he'd been in for hours. Eleanor sat back in her chair with Thomas against her shoulder and felt the night catch up with her all at once. The exhaustion arriving like a wave she'd been outrunning and had finally stopped running from. Gideon was sitting across from her on the low stool he'd pulled up hours ago. He'd barely said 20 words the whole night. He'd just done what needed doing, reliably, without drama, every time she'd needed it. "He's going to be all right," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Looks like it," Gideon said. She looked at him across the dim room, at this man who had been up all night for a child that wasn't his, for no reason except that Eleanor had needed someone at her back and he had been there. He looked tired in the plain, unadorned way of someone who had worked hard and hadn't slept, hair disordered, jaw unshaved, his big hands resting on his knees. "You stayed," she said. He looked at her. "Of course I stayed." The way he said it, of course, like staying was such an obvious thing that the alternative hadn't been a real option, sat in her chest like heat. She didn't cry. She was too tired and too relieved, and the emotion was something more complicated than crying anyway. It was the feeling of being seen, fully and without ceremony, by someone who asked for nothing from the scene. She looked away from him, down at Thomas's small, sleeping face. "He looks like James," she said quietly. It was the first time she'd said his name to Gideon. Gideon didn't say anything. He didn't fill the space the way people sometimes do when they're uncomfortable with grief. "He had James's ears," she said. "I noticed in the first week, these ears." She touched them lightly. "James would have—" She stopped. He would have liked having a son this young. He was tired by the time Henry and Will were born. He was a better father when he was younger. She paused. "That's not a kind thing to say." "It's an honest thing," Gideon said. She looked at him again. "Did you ever—" She wasn't sure how to finish. "Have you ever wanted a family?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I didn't think about it as wanting," he said finally. "I just didn't expect it. Didn't think it was the kind of thing that was in front of me." He looked at his hands. "Turns out I was wrong about what was in front of me." Eleanor held Thomas a little tighter. Outside, the Montana dark was beginning to thin. The first gray suggestion of dawn was coming in at the edges of the window, slow and cold and certain, the way dawn comes whether you've slept or not. Neither of them moved to get up. They sat in the thin early light with a sleeping baby between them and said nothing else. And somehow that nothing was the most honest conversation Eleanor had had with another person in longer than she could accurately remember. The hearing was 3 weeks away. Fitch still had his plans and his paperwork and his clerk with the leather satchel. But in that pale, exhausted dawn, sitting in a ranch house 12 miles north of a town that had never wanted her there, Eleanor Voss felt the thing she'd stopped letting herself feel a long time ago. She felt like someone was on her side. Not in a grand or declared way, not in the way of speeches and promises, in the quiet, practical, of course I stayed way that meant more than any speech could. She pressed her face briefly against the top of Thomas's head and breathed. 3 weeks, she told herself. 3 weeks, and then we fight. The 3 weeks between Thomas's fever and the hearing passed the way hard waiting always passes. Too slow during the days, too fast when Eleanor added them up at the end. She and Gideon didn't speak directly about what had happened that night. There was no conversation where they acknowledged the shift, no moment where either of them said something has changed between us. That wasn't how either of them operated. They were people who moved forward by doing the next necessary thing, and the next necessary thing was the courthouse, so that was where their attention went. But things were different, not dramatically, just in the small calibrations of two people who had spent a night at the edge of something frightening and come out the other side still standing next to each other. He started leaving a second coffee cup on the table in the mornings. She started saving him the end piece of the bread, which was the best part, and both of them knew it. When he came in from the cold, he stopped going to the far side of the room first. He came to the stove, where she usually was, and stood close enough to warm his hands without it being a thing that required comment. Small adjustments. The kind that accumulate quietly until one day you look up and realize the geometry of your life has rearranged itself around another person. Eleanor noticed all of it. She noticed, and she didn't say anything because saying something would make it fragile in a way that silence wouldn't, and she needed it to be strong right now. She had a courthouse to walk into. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house. The stove cooling, the wind off the plains, the small sleep sounds of children in the next room. And she ran through everything in her mind the way you run your hands over a rope before trusting your weight to it. The marriage certificate. The letter she'd written to the judge. The months of records she'd kept in a small notebook. What the children had eaten, what work they'd done, what they'd studied. Thomas's weight and health. Every repair made to the ranch. Every supply purchased. She documented it the way a woman documents things when she knows documentation is her only weapon. She heard his boots on the porch before he knocked quietly on the doorframe. She'd left the door ajar. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He came in and sat in the chair by the window. Not her chair, the other one. He didn't bring a lamp. "You should sleep," he said. "I know. You know the case. Writing it out again in your head won't change it." "I know that too." She stared at the ceiling. "I keep thinking about Fitch's face when he rode out here in December, the way he looked at the children, like they were—" She stopped. "Like they were inventory set," Gideon said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "He's done it before. Moved on people's land through legal pressure, family instability, debt. He's got the sheriff and 2 of the county commissioners. He's been building toward owning this whole northern valley for years. Why didn't you fight him sooner?" "Because alone, I didn't have much to fight with." He said it without self-pity, matter-of-factly. A single man on a ranch he bought with cash and no connections to anybody. That's not a hard thing to isolate. He was waiting for the right moment. A pause. "I think he's going to find the moment has passed." Eleanor turned her head to look at him in the dark. He was just a shape in the chair, the outline of broad shoulders and a bowed head. "Gideon," she said. Why were you alone out here so long?" The question sat between them. She heard him breathe. "Was married once," he said. "Long time ago. Before Montana. She died." He said it simply, the way you say the name of a weather event that leveled something years back. "Fever, same as your James. Fast." He paused. "After that I just got used to less. Less people, less noise, less of everything. It gets to be a habit." "A habit you can give up?" He thought about that longer than she expected. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I don't mind trying." She looked back at the ceiling. "Get some sleep," he said again, gently, and after a moment she heard him stand and leave, and somehow after that she did sleep, which she hadn't expected. They drove into Red Hollow the next morning in the wagon, all 12 of them. Eleanor had debated leaving the younger children behind and decided against it. She wanted the judge to see what was being discussed, not an abstract number of children, not a county filing with names listed in a column, but actual people who had actual faces and had eaten breakfast this morning and were wearing clean clothes because Clara had pressed them the night before with the flat iron. The courthouse was the grandest building in Red Hollow, which wasn't saying a great deal. 2 stories, brick, with a painted sign above the door that was peeling at one corner. A small crowd had gathered outside, which Eleanor had not expected, and which told her that Fitch had made sure people would be there to watch. She got down from the wagon without looking at the crowd. She could feel them the way you feel weather, not by looking directly at it, but by the pressure of it against your skin. She helped May down, took Thomas from Clara, and walked up the steps with her back straight and her face arranged into an expression that gave nothing away. Gideon walked beside her. He'd put on his good coat. She hadn't said anything about it, but she'd noticed. Inside the courtroom, Fitch was already seated at one table with Peabody and a lawyer Eleanor didn't recognize. Young, city-dressed, with the slightly superior expression of someone who'd come up from Billings and considered this all fairly manageable. At the other table sat an older man Gideon had arranged, a lawyer named Harlan Pruitt, who was not young and not city-dressed, and had the appearance of someone who had been in more courtrooms than he could accurately count, and was no longer impressed by any of them. Pruitt had reviewed Eleanor's notebook. He'd spent 2 hours at the kitchen table going through every page, asking questions in a flat, direct way. And when he was done, he'd said, "This is a good record, Mrs. Cross. You kept it like someone who knew they might need it." And Eleanor had said, "I did know." And he'd looked at her with something close to respect. Judge Warren Cale was in his 60s, with white hair and a face that had stopped performing expressions some years back and now simply presented information neutrally. He sat down, looked at both tables, and said, "Let's get on with it." Fitch's lawyer went first. He laid out the county's position in careful, measured language. The original situation in November, Mrs. Voss's circumstances, the unrelated male guardian, the moral and legal questions of suitable environment, the county's responsibility for the welfare of minor children. He cited statutes. He spoke about stability and proper arrangements. He had a way of making everything sound both deeply reasonable and vaguely threatening at the same time. Then he said, almost as an aside, "We note that a marriage did take place in January, though the circumstances and timing of that arrangement raise questions of their own about whether it represents a genuine—" "Move on," Judge Cale said. The lawyer paused. "Your Honor, the county's position is that the marriage itself may be—" "I said move on. I'll assess the marriage myself." The lawyer moved on, but he'd planted the seed he wanted, and Eleanor felt it sitting in the room like smoke. Pruitt's turn was different in texture. He stood up without any particular drama and said, "I'd like to submit documentation to the court," and handed the judge Eleanor's notebook. Judge Cale turned it over in his hands. "This is a daily record," Pruitt said, "kept by Mrs. Cross, formerly Mrs. Voss, from the day her family arrived at the Cross Ranch in November through this week. It details the children's meals, their schooling, their health, their work on the ranch, and their development over the past 3.5 months." He let the judge look at a page. "I'd also like to call Mrs. Cross to speak." Eleanor had known this was coming. She stood up and crossed to the front of the courtroom and turned to face the judge. She was aware of the room behind her. Fitch at his table, the lawyer, Peabody with his satchel, and along the back wall, several townspeople who had filed in for the show. She was also aware of Gideon at the defendant's table, watching her, and of Henry, seated beside him, doing the same. She answered Pruitt's questions directly. Yes, she was the children's mother and sole legal guardian since her husband's death. Yes, she had married Gideon Cross of her own decision. Yes, the children were housed, fed, schooled, and working on the ranch. Yes, she kept records because she understood the responsibility of 10 children and took it seriously. Then the county's lawyer stood up. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "isn't it true that the marriage took place specifically in response to the county's inquiry? That it was in effect a legal maneuver rather than a—" "It took place," Eleanor said, "because I needed to protect my children from a legal maneuver. Those aren't the same thing." A sound in the room. Not quite laughter, not quite approval. "But you'd known Mr. Cross for only 7 weeks at the time of the marriage. I'd known him long enough to see who he was," she said. "And who is he in your assessment?" Eleanor looked at the lawyer. Then, without planning to, she looked at Gideon. He was watching her with that steady expression that gave nothing away to people who didn't know how to read it. She knew now. She'd spent 3 months learning the language of a face that didn't broadcast itself, and she read it plainly. He was there, completely, every bit of his attention on her, the way he'd been completely there the night of Thomas's fever and the morning of the wedding and every freezing dawn when he'd already been working an hour before anyone else was up. She looked back at the lawyer. "He's a man who showed up," she said, "when nobody else would." The room was quiet. "That's not a legal assessment," the lawyer said. "No," Eleanor said. "It's a true one." Pruitt said nothing and sat back with the expression of a man who has learned when to leave things alone. Judge Cale took a recess of 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes were the longest Eleanor could remember sitting through since the morning the creditors had come to the ranch in Billings. She sat with Gideon and Pruitt at the table. Gideon poured water from the pitcher. She didn't drink it, but she held the glass. May had been sitting on the bench behind them, and she leaned forward between their shoulders and whispered, very seriously, "Is it going to be okay?" Gideon turned slightly. He looked at May's anxious small face. "Yes," he said. "Not, I think so, not, I hope so, just yes, flat and certain," the way he said things he'd decided on. May sat back. Eleanor heard her relay this information to Sam in a satisfied whisper. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the empty judge's bench. "You don't know that," she said quietly. "No," he said. But she needed to hear it. Eleanor looked down at the glass of water in her hands. Fitch caught her eye from across the room. He gave her the careful, considered look of a man who still believed he held the better cards. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, not because she was intimidated, but because she was done giving him her attention. When Judge Cale came back, he did not sit down immediately. He stood at the bench and looked at his notes and then at both tables, and the room waited. "I've reviewed the documentation submitted by the respondent," he said. "I've heard both arguments." He looked at Fitch's table. "The county's petition rests substantially on the claim of unsuitable domestic arrangements. The respondent's household is now a legally married household. That renders the primary basis of the petition moot." He paused. "I've also reviewed the record kept by Mrs. Cross. It is detailed, consistent, and demonstrates a level of care and organization that this court rarely sees documented so thoroughly." He looked at Peabody. "The children are clothed, fed, schooled, and by all observable evidence, well. The petition is dismissed." Dismissed. The word took a moment to land. Eleanor heard it, and then heard it again a second time inside her head, the second time being the one that reached all the way down. She heard the sound from behind her, not from Fitch's side, but from the back of the room where the townspeople sat, a low collective exhale that was half surprise and half something else. She didn't turn around. Fitch stood up. "Your Honor, with respect." "Mr. Fitch," Judge Cale said, "the petition is dismissed. That's the ruling. Sit down." He said it with the weariness of a man who has watched powerful people try to stay in rooms after being asked to leave more times than he can count. "If you'd like to appeal, you know the process. Good day." He stood, and the room stood with him, and that was that. Outside on the courthouse steps, Eleanor stood in the thin February sunlight and breathed cold air, and did not cry. She had not cried once through the whole of the last 4 months. Not in Red Hollow with the broken wagon, not when the creditors came, not the night Thomas had the fever, and she did not cry now. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complete than relief, like a mechanism releasing that had been under tension for a very long time. Henry came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He was 14 and male and had been taught that strong feelings were best expressed by standing near someone and not talking, and Eleanor had never loved this quality in him more than she did right now. May went directly to Gideon, who had come down the steps behind them, and grabbed his hand with both of hers. He let her. Fitch came out of this courthouse a few minutes later with his lawyer and Peabody. He walked past them on the steps without stopping, his face closed and red. The lawyer followed. Peabody hesitated at the door, looked at Eleanor, and something passed across his face, not quite an apology, but something adjacent to it. Then he followed Fitch down the street. The townspeople who had gathered to watch filtered out in small groups. Eleanor recognized the woman from the dry goods counter, who looked at her now with an expression that had lost the righteousness and gained something more neutral. Eleanor looked back without any particular warmth. Pruitt shook her hand and then Gideon's. Good record-keeping won the day, he said to Eleanor. That notebook. I thought it might come to this, she said. Smart woman. He put it on his hat. Good luck with the spring. He left. The children drifted around the wagon, the younger ones with the loud cheerfulness of people who hadn't fully understood what was at stake and were just happy to be somewhere with something happening. Clara appeared at Eleanor's elbow. We won, she said. We won, Eleanor said. Clara nodded, absorbing this. Good, she said, with a 12-year-old's talent for understatement. Can we get flour? We're almost out. Eleanor laughed. It came out rough and sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that has exhaustion underneath it. Clara looked surprised. It had been a long time since she'd heard her mother laugh like that. Gideon was hitching the horse. He glanced over at the sound of it. Their eyes met across the yard. He didn't smile exactly, but the lines around his eyes shifted in a way Eleanor had learned to read as its own thing. A private acknowledgement, something passing between two people who had been through something together and come out the right side. She looked away and went to help with the wagon. On the ride home, the younger children were loud and restless with released tension, jostling each other, someone crying briefly over a scuffle for space, May falling asleep against Eleanor's side with the boneless, total collapse of small children. Henry rode up front with Gideon. Eleanor could hear fragments of their conversation. Something about the north fence, something about the spring cattle schedule, and she heard in Henry's voice something that had been absent for months. Not happiness exactly. Something more structural than that. Steadiness. The boy sounded steady. She looked down at May's sleeping face in her lap and thought about James. Not with grief this time, but with something more complicated. The way you think about someone you loved who was also imperfect, who left holes they didn't mean to leave. She thought that James would have been grateful for what Gideon Cross had done, and she thought that James would have understood that gratitude was not a betrayal of anything. The ranch appeared through the bare trees as the light was going, solid and smoke-trailed and lamp-lit from the inside because Clara had ridden ahead and put the fire on. Its walls held the cold out the same way they had on the first evening back in November. But it was different now. It was different the way a place becomes different when it stops being a temporary arrangement and becomes the shape of your actual life. That evening, after the children were fed and the younger ones in bed, Eleanor and Gideon sat at the kitchen table in a comfortable quiet that was different from the careful quiet of the early weeks. The kind that comes when two people have stopped performing normalcy and are just living it. He's not done, Gideon said. Fitch. He'll come at this another way. I know, Eleanor said. Might be worth thinking about the spring, the land, the contracts, making sure everything is documented properly. Gideon, she looked at him. Can we have one evening? He looked at her. A pause. Yes, he said. We can have one evening. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, the Montana night was cold and enormous and full of whatever tomorrow would bring. But for now the walls held, the fire burned, and every person who belonged inside that house was inside it. It was enough. For tonight, it was exactly enough. Gideon had been right about Fitch. He usually was, about things like that, about the particular persistence of men who are used to getting what they want, and have not yet been made to understand that this time will be different. The first sign came 2 weeks after the hearing in early March, when Gideon rode to the trading post for wire and came back with the news that the bank in Red Hollow had begun a review of his land deed. Not a foreclosure, not yet, just a review. A quiet administrative action that meant nothing on its own and everything as a signal. Fitch held a significant interest in that bank. Everyone in the Northern Valley knew it, the same way everyone knows which direction the wind comes from without ever being formally told. Gideon set the wire down in the barn and told Eleanor that evening at the table with the same flat voice he used for all significant information: cattle prices, weather predictions, legal threats. Eleanor had learned to listen to what was underneath that voice rather than the voice itself. Underneath this one was something taut and controlled, the sound of a man who had been expecting exactly this and was not surprised and was also, quietly, furious. He can't take the land, Eleanor said. The deed is clear. The deed is clear, Gideon agreed. But a bank review means lawyers, and lawyers mean time and money are things Fitch has more of than most people out here. He looked at his hands on the table. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to wear us down until we sell. We're not selling. No, he said. We're not. Eleanor looked at the table. She thought about the notebook she'd kept through the winter. All that careful documentation, every meal and lesson and fence repair. And she thought about how documentation only works if you have someone to present it to. And a bank review happened behind closed doors between men who had known each other for years. We need to talk to Pruitt, she said. Already sent word. She looked up. He'd already sent word. Before supper, before telling her, before the evening had settled. He'd ridden in, learned the thing, assessed it, and taken the first step, and then come home and sat down to eat with the children like a man who had his priorities in the right order. She thought sometimes about the version of this life she might have had if she'd married a man like Fitch, powerful, loud, certain of himself in the particular way of men who've never had to question whether the world would accommodate them. She thought about it, and she was not tempted by it even slightly, and that told her something about who she'd become. All right, she said. What else? There's talk that Fitch approached two of our neighbors, Bauer to the east and the Calloway widow south of town, offering to buy their grazing rights. If he gets those, he can restrict our cattle movement through the valley come summer. He paused. It's a slow squeeze. Can we get to them first, Bauer and the widow? I've been thinking about that. He looked at her. Bauer might listen to you better than to me. We've never been close. But he's got a wife and 3 daughters, and he's the kind of man who respects a woman who knows her business. Eleanor almost smiled at that. 6 months ago, nobody in this county had considered her a woman who knew her business. She'd been the broken widow with too many children and nowhere to go. It was remarkable what surviving a winter could do to a person's standing. I'll go see Bauer, she said, this week, and I'll ride to the Calloway place. Henry, who had been sitting at the far end of the table doing his reading and listening to all of this in the particular way he listened to things, quiet, absorbed, storing it, looked up. What do you need me to do? Gideon looked at him. Keep the ranch running while we're gone. Can you manage that? Henry was 14 years and 3 months old. He looked at Gideon with the steadiness that had been building in him since November, that structural quality Eleanor had heard in his voice on the ride home from the courthouse. Yes, he said. I can manage that. Gideon nodded once. No praise, no elaboration. Just the acknowledgement of one person telling another that they're capable of the thing they've said they're capable of. Henry received it and went back to his reading, and Eleanor watched her son's shoulders carry the weight differently than they had even a month ago. Not hunched against it, just bearing it, the way you bear something that has become familiar. She thought, James would not recognize this boy. And then, immediately after, that's not entirely a bad thing. She went to see Carl Bauer on a Thursday, driving the smaller wagon alone, which she hadn't done since before Thomas was born. It was the first truly warm day of early March, the sky that particular pale blue of thawing country, mud showing through the snow in the south-facing patches. She could smell the season turning. After the winter they'd had, that smell was almost aggressive in its promise. Bauer's ranch was 8 miles east, a tidier operation than Gideon's, the kind of place where everything had been painted once and was due for painting again. Carl Bauer himself came out when he heard the wagon, a compact, watchful man in his 40s with a beard gone mostly gray and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years looking into wind. His wife Marta appeared at the door behind him. She was round-faced and quick-eyed and looked at Eleanor with open curiosity, the non-hostile kind. Mrs. Cross, Bauer said. He'd heard about the courthouse. Everyone had heard about the courthouse. Mr. Bauer, Eleanor said. I'll be direct if that's all right. I know Fitch has been talking to you. Bauer looked at her for a moment. Come in, he said. They sat at his kitchen table and Marta put coffee down without asking and stayed to listen, which Eleanor respected. Bauer was the kind of man who didn't make decisions without his wife knowing them, and that told Eleanor something useful about him. She laid it out plainly. What Fitch was doing, the bank review, the grazing rights, the slow legal pressure designed to make isolated families feel like selling was the only way out of a trap they hadn't set for themselves. She told him what the Northern Valley would look like if Fitch controlled the grazing rights, and the bank, and the county commissioners. Not a prediction, just a geometry. One man controlling the land, the credit, and the political apparatus meant that every rancher in the valley would eventually operate on Fitch's terms. or not at all. Bauer listened. He drank his coffee. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "And what do you want from me?" "I want you to hold your grazing rights. Don't sell, don't lease, not to Fitch or anyone connected to him. And I want to know if you'd be willing to talk to your other neighbors, not asking them to do anything except stay put." Bauer looked at his wife. Something passed between them that Eleanor recognized as a full conversation in 3 seconds. "Fitch offered a fair price," Bauer said. "He always does," Eleanor said. "Right up until he doesn't have to." Marta spoke for the first time. "What happens to your family if Fitch gets what he wants?" "We lose the ranch," Eleanor said. "Or we spend the next 5 years in legal battles that cost more than we have." She paused. "I have 10 children, Mrs. Bauer. I'm not inclined to let either thing happen." Marta looked at her husband. Bauer set down his cup. "I'll hold the rights," he said, "and I'll talk to Hendricks and the Palmers. Can't promise what they'll do." "I'm not asking for promises," Eleanor said. "Just a conversation." She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the windows of the wagon letting in the first real warmth of the year, and she felt for the first time since November that they were not simply holding a defensive position. They were pushing back. Gideon's visit to the Calloway widow, a practical, unsentimental woman named Agnes who had been running her ranch alone since her husband broke his neck falling from a horse 4 years ago, went similarly. Agnes Calloway had heard enough about Fitch over the years to have her own opinions, and they were not favorable. She told Gideon she had no intention of selling anything to that man, and that she was glad someone had finally thought to coordinate, because she'd been watching his operations with increasing displeasure for 2 years and hadn't known who to say it to. Gideon came home that evening and reported this to Eleanor, and for a moment they sat with the particular satisfaction of people who have done effective work and know it without needing to announce it. "Agnes Calloway," Eleanor said. "I'd like to meet her." "She said the same about you," Gideon said. Pruitt came out to the ranch the following week and spent an afternoon reviewing the deed and the bank correspondence. He was thorough and unhurried, and at the end he said what Eleanor had suspected. The bank review was irregular, procedurally thin, more harassment than legal substance. He wrote 2 letters, one to the bank's board of directors, one to the state banking commissioner in Helena, detailing the irregularities and noting that the timing of the review followed a dismissed custody petition involving the same individual, Mr. Aldous Fitch, by exactly 12 days. "That's not evidence of conspiracy," Pruitt said, "but it's a pattern, and patterns make people uncomfortable." He capped his pen. "I'd expect the review to quietly disappear within a month." It disappeared in 3 weeks. There was no announcement, no letter of apology. One morning, the bank review simply ceased to be an active matter, the same way a fire ceases to be active when you take away what it was burning. Fitch's name was not mentioned in any of the subsequent paperwork, which meant absolutely nothing and also meant everything. Eleanor noted it in her new notebook, the one she'd started after the courthouse, because she had decided she would be a woman who kept records for the rest of her life, regardless of whether she needed to present them to anyone. Documentation was not just a weapon. It was also a kind of memory, a way of saying, "This happened, I was here, it mattered." She wrote the date and the fact and closed the notebook and went to start dinner. Spring came to the Montana plains the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with winter, a back and forth of warm days and late cold snaps, mud and then frost and then mud again, until one morning you wake up and the balance has shifted decisively, and the cold is gone, and the world is wet and green and relentlessly alive. The children ran outside. That was the first signal. After months of bundled containment, of being kept close and warm and indoor, they simply poured out of the house one morning in early April and didn't come back until dinner. And the sounds of them in the fields, the shouting and the laughter and the occasional shriek of someone falling into mud, filled the ranch with a noise that Gideon had not heard in this place in years. He stood on the porch in the morning watching them and didn't say anything, but Eleanor watched him watching, and she saw in his face something she recognized because she'd felt it herself. The surprise of a life that turned out to contain more than you'd planned for, arriving not in the way you might have expected, but in the specific form it chose, which was 10 loud children and mud, and the end of a difficult winter and someone standing next to you who knew what it had cost. "Loud," he said. "Very," she agreed. "Good loud or bad loud?" She considered. Overwhelmingly good loud. He nodded, satisfied, and went to start the fence work. Thomas, who was 7 months old now, and had survived both a Montana winter and a county custody petition and a fever that had scared them all badly, was sitting up on his own and had recently discovered that dropping things and watching them fall was an activity of infinite entertainment. He sat in the yard under Clara's supervision and dropped a wooden spoon off his knee repeatedly, watching it hit the dirt with an expression of scientific satisfaction. Sam had expanded his chicken operation. This was not an exaggeration. He had somehow negotiated with Gideon for 3 additional hens, had named all 11 of them, and had produced a small ledger in which he tracked daily egg counts with the seriousness of a business owner reviewing quarterly numbers. When Eleanor had looked at the ledger, she'd felt something complicated and warm. Her son, 8 years old, keeping records. She taught him that. Not by instructing him, just by doing it herself, where he could see. That was the thing about children. Eleanor had learned over 14 years of raising them. They didn't learn what you told them. They learned what they watched. It was in April that the question of Eleanor's original property came back to the surface. The ranch near Billings, James's ranch, the one the creditors had taken, had changed hands once since then. The man who'd bought it, a cattle operation out of Wyoming, had run it for 1 season and found it unprofitable and was looking to divest. Gideon heard this through the Trading Post network, which carried information about land and prices the way rivers carry water, continuously and without particular announcement. He told Eleanor on a Sunday evening when the children were settled and the house was quiet. She sat with it for a moment. The ranch near Billings was 140 miles away and 7 months behind her, and she had not thought about it in weeks. But hearing that it was available stirred something she hadn't expected. Not grief, not exactly nostalgia, but something more architectural. The sense of a shape that had been removed from the structure of her life and left a space. "What's the asking price?" she said. He told her. It was not small, but it was not impossible. Not with the winter behind them, not with the ranch producing again, not with the accounts Eleanor had been keeping and the careful frugality of the past months. "We couldn't do it now," she said. "No, not now." He looked at the table. "But Henry's 14. 4 years, maybe 5, it might be different." Eleanor understood what he was saying. Not, "Let's buy back your dead husband's land." Not, "Let's reclaim the past." What he was saying was, Henry is going to be a man soon, and a man should have something of his own, and this particular something would mean something particular to him. She looked at Gideon across the table. This man she'd known for 5 months, who had given her shelter and paperwork and coffee, and of course, I stayed at 4 in the morning, and a wooden box with compartments for children's small things. "You do that," she said. "Work toward that." "It makes sense," he said. "The land's good land. Henry knows it. It should stay in the family." The family. He said it like it was a fact that had always been true. She thought about the morning she'd driven away from that ranch in Billings with $11 and 10 children, and a broken belief in the idea that the world was basically fair. She thought about 2 nights in the dirt in Red Hollow while the town watched through its curtained windows. She thought about a man she'd known for 20 minutes taking her 6-year-old's hand in the mud and keeping walking. "Yes," she said. "We work toward that." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, the spring night was warm enough to have the window cracked for the first time since October, and through it came the sound of the plains, that deep, continuous, indifferent breathing that had been going on since before any of them were born and would go on long after. And it didn't feel threatening the way it had in November. It felt like context, like the reminder that the world is large and mostly unconcerned with your particular story, which is not as discouraging as it sounds. It means your story is yours to shape. May brought real warmth and with it a steady stream of work that expanded to fill every hour of daylight. Gideon and Henry rebuilt the east fence from the ground up, a 3-week project that involved early mornings and sore hands and a developing vocabulary of mutual complaint that functioned, Eleanor observed, as a kind of father-son shorthand, even though neither of them would have used those words. She heard them once, coming in for lunch. Henry saying something about the second fence post in the 3rd row, and Gideon saying something back that made Henry laugh. Not a polite laugh, a real one, surprised out of him. and the sound of it stopped her at the kitchen window for a moment. Henry didn't laugh like that often. He was a serious boy who had spent 2 years watching his father disappear slowly under a weight he never shared, and seriousness had become his default setting. But this was a different sound, something lighter. She went back to the bread. Clara, who was 12 and already looking at the world with a young woman's full-spectrum attention, had started helping Eleanor with the household accounts. Not because Eleanor asked her to, because she'd watched Eleanor doing them and pulled up a chair one evening and said, "Show me how this works." So Eleanor had shown her the columns, the running totals, the categories, the forward projections for supplies. Clara was good at it, faster than Eleanor actually, at the arithmetic, because she was young and her mind moved quickly and hadn't yet been slowed down by years of worry. Eleanor told her this, and Clara received the compliment with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who already knew it and was glad to have it confirmed. "What did you want to be?" Clara asked one evening. "Before, when you were young." Eleanor thought about it. "A teacher," she said. "I wanted to teach." "Why didn't you?" "I married your father instead." She said it without bitterness, just fact. Clara considered this. "You still teach. You teach us." "That's not quite the same." "Why not?" Eleanor looked at her daughter, 12 years old, serious-faced, with her father's dark eyes and something around the mouth that was entirely her own. A particular set to it that meant she'd already decided more things than she'd told anyone. "You're right," Eleanor said. "It's not entirely different." Clara nodded, satisfied, and went back to the columns. The day Aldous Fitch left Red Hollow was a Tuesday in late May, and Eleanor heard about it from Marta Bauer, who heard about it from the woman at the dry goods counter, who had it firsthand from the bank clerk. The banking commissioner's inquiry, the one Pruitt had triggered with his letter, had expanded beyond the crossland deed. It had opened up into a broader examination of the bank's practices, specifically regarding a pattern of reviews, foreclosures, and land acquisitions that consistently benefited the same individual. Fitch had seen it coming, apparently, the way people who've been operating at the edge of what's legal always see these things coming, not early enough to stop them, but early enough to leave before the full accounting arrived. He'd sold his house and his business interest in the bank to a buyer from out of state, collected what he could move quickly, and gone. Word was he'd gone east. Word was he wouldn't be coming back. Eleanor heard this at the Bauer kitchen table, where she'd come to return a borrowed tool, with Marta across from her and coffee between them, and she sat with it for a long moment. She didn't feel triumphant. That surprised her a little. She'd spent months braced against this man, his lawyers, his paperwork, his small calculating eyes, his willingness to use her children as leverage in a land dispute. And she'd expected his departure to feel like something more dramatic. A door slamming, a weight lifting. Instead, it felt like weather changing, like a front moving through. "Are you glad?" Marta asked. Yes, Eleanor said. "And I'm tired of being relieved. I'd like to reach a point where I stop needing to be relieved." Marta smiled. She was a practical woman who'd built her own life in hard country and had no patience for anything that wasn't real. "That point exists," she said. "It just takes a while to get there." "How long?" Marta thought about it genuinely. "For me, about 6 years after Carl and I stopped having to fight for the place. One day I woke up and I wasn't calculating threats anymore. I was just living." She shrugged. "It sneaks up on you." Eleanor drove home with that in her head. It sneaks up on you. She thought about that. She thought about the fact that sometime in the past month she had started sleeping through the night without waking to calculate threats, and she hadn't noticed it happen. Maybe it had already started. She told Gideon about Fitch that evening. He listened, drank his coffee, and said, "Good," in the flat, conclusive way of someone marking a column closed in a ledger. "That's all?" she said. "What else should it be?" She thought about it. "I don't know. I expected to feel more." "Fitch leaving doesn't change what we built," Gideon said. "Doesn't add anything, and it doesn't take anything. We were going to be fine either way." She looked at him. "You believe that?" "I believed it in February when we walked into that courthouse," he said. "Fitch was never the point. Getting this family stable, that was the point." She sat with that. Getting this family stable, as though it had been the objective all along, From the moment he rode in from the north on a cold November day and looked at a broken wagon and a woman with a baby on her hip and 10 children behind her and didn't see a problem to solve or a burden to calculate, but something straightforward, a family that needed help. She'd been trying to figure out for 5 months why he'd done it. Not the legal reasons or the practical ones. Those were real, but they came later. She meant the first impulse, the first moment on that road. She'd never asked him directly. "Why did you stop?" she said. He looked at her. "In November, you rode in from the north. You could have kept going. You could have bought your supplies and gone home and let the county handle it." She held his gaze. "Why did you stop?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Your little girl," he said finally. "The 6-year-old. May." She was standing at the edge of the wagon looking at the town. Not crying, not asking anyone for anything, just looking at it like she was trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. He paused. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was 6 years old, and she was standing in the cold trying to understand why nobody was helping her family. He set the cup down. "I couldn't keep riding past that." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "May won't remember it," she said. "She was too young." "I know, but you will." "Yes," he said. "I will." She stood up and crossed the kitchen, and she kissed him. Not tentatively, not as a performance of gratitude, but as a full and direct expression of something she'd been arriving at for 5 months and had finally reached. He was still for exactly 1 second, like a man who is surprised by a thing he has been hoping for, and then he was not still. When she pulled back, she looked at his face. Weathered, imperfect, permanently squinted from too many years looking into distance, and she thought, "I did not plan for this. I did not plan for any of this. The broken wheel, the town that turned its back, the winter, the courthouse, the fever, all of it. None of it was planned, and all of it led here, to this kitchen, to this face." There was something worth knowing in that. Something about the difference between the life you map out in advance and the life that actually happens to you, and how the unplanned one sometimes turns out to carry things the planned one never could have. "I should check on the children," she said. "Yes," he said. His voice was different by exactly 1 degree. "You should." She went, and she heard very quietly from the kitchen behind her the sound of a man exhaling. The long, slow exhale of someone who has been holding tension in his body for a very long time and has just, for the first time, put it down. Henry turned 15 in June. They marked it with a cake Clara made from scratch, with only 2 visible disasters. A collapsed center she filled with extra frosting, and a minor scorching on one side that she turned toward the wall, and a dinner that ran long because everyone kept talking over each other and nobody wanted it to end. Even Gideon stayed at the table past his usual time, listening to the cross conversations with the particular expression Eleanor had come to know as his version of contentment. Still, attentive, present. Gideon gave Henry a pocket knife. Good steel, wooden handle, the kind that lasts decades if you take care of it. Henry turned it over in his hands. He looked at Gideon. "This is your knife," he said. "I've seen you use it." "I've got another one," Gideon said. "That one should go to someone who'll use it." Henry looked back down at the knife. His jaw moved in the way of young men who have feelings they haven't learned to articulate yet. "Thank you," he said. "Take care of it," Gideon said. "It'll take care of you." Eleanor watched this from her end of the table. She watched her son and this man exchange something wordless and significant across a birthday cake, and she thought about all the things a father is supposed to give a son. Not the grand gestures, not the speeches, but the small, sustained daily things. Attention. Expectation. The sense that someone is watching you become yourself and thinks you're doing it right. Henry had had that with James for 12 years. He'd had it taken away. And now, without announcement or ceremony, in the way of all the important things in this household, it had been given back. She didn't say anything. Some things you let be. In July, Eleanor rode to Billings. She went alone, a 2-day trip, and she stood at the edge of her old property and looked at it in the summer light. The house was still standing. Someone had let the kitchen garden go, and the fence on the south side needed work, but the structure was sound. James had built it to last, and it had lasted, indifferent to what had happened to the family who'd lived inside it. She stood there for a long time. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, which was grief. What she felt instead was something more complicated, a conversation with herself about what she was owed and what she'd made and what the difference was. James had built this. She and James together had built it, and then debt and fever had taken it, and she'd dragged herself and her children across frozen country and landed in a broken wagon in the dirt and been remade by the winter into something harder and more flexible than she'd been before. She didn't want to undo that, even if she could. The woman who'd driven away from this ranch in November, that particular combination of grief and fear and desperate competence, she didn't want to undo her either. But she also wasn't that woman anymore. She took out her notebook. She wrote down the condition of the property, the repairs it would need, a rough estimate of costs. She wrote it practically, with the eye of someone assessing a future investment rather than mourning a past loss. She closed the notebook and rode back toward the north. On an evening in August, Gideon moved his things from the bunkhouse into the main house. There was no announcement, no marked occasion. He simply came in from the barn one evening carrying a box of his things, a few books, his spare kit, the small items a man accumulates, and set it down in the hallway with the practical air of someone completing a logical task. May, who happened to be passing through, looked at the box, looked at Gideon. "Are you staying in the house now?" she said. "Yes," he said. May considered this. "Okay," she said, and continued into the kitchen. Henry, appearing behind her, looked at the box and then at Gideon and gave a nod that carried more weight than most speeches. Will said, "About time," and kept walking, which made Gideon stop and look at his back for a moment with an expression Eleanor caught from the kitchen doorway. Surprise followed immediately by something that was not quite a smile but functioned as one. She met his eyes across the hallway. "About time," she agreed. He picked up the box and went down the hall, and Eleanor went back to the stove, and the house rearranged itself once more around its inhabitants. The last small adjustment in a series of adjustments that had been happening since November, each one slight, each one in the same direction, all of them adding up to something nobody had planned and everyone had needed. By the following November, 1 year from the broken wagon and the town that wouldn't open its doors, the ranch was in better shape than it had been in years. The east fence was rebuilt. The cattle numbers were up. Eleanor's kitchen garden, which she'd started in spring and tended through summer with the help of May and Sam, had produced more than they'd expected, and they'd put up enough preserves to carry them well past the next winter. Pruitt had written with news. The bank's new management, under the commissioner's oversight, had reviewed and closed several of the irregular actions from the Fitch era. 2 families in the valley had had properties returned to them, or foreclosures reversed. The Northern Valley, for the first time in years, was operating without the steady pressure of a man who wanted to own all of it. Agnes Calloway had come to dinner twice over the summer. She and Eleanor had developed a friendship built on the kind of mutual respect that comes from recognizing someone who has survived hard things and made something out of them. Agnes had never remarried and said she didn't intend to, and Eleanor respected this without thinking it was wrong or right. Just a person's own particular calculation, as legitimate as any other. Eleanor had also written to her sister Margaret in Helena. That letter had taken 4 drafts, and 2 weeks of putting it down and picking it back up. The argument between them, the one that had seemed so enormous and now seemed like furniture in a burned house, had been about money and about Eleanor's loyalty and about a thing James had said once that Margaret had taken wrong and Eleanor had defended too hard. Eleanor had spent 4 years not writing, and Margaret had spent 4 years not writing back. And in the end, the letter Eleanor sent was short, because the long version kept becoming an argument with a person who wasn't in the room. She wrote, "I am married again. My children are well. I have had a hard year and come out the other side of it. I would like to know my sister again if she is willing." She signed it. She sent it. Margaret wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was cautious and brief and acknowledged nothing specifically, which was so exactly like Margaret that Eleanor laughed at the kitchen table and Gideon looked up from his coffee. "Good news?" he said. "My sister wrote back," Eleanor said. "And?" She managed to be both glad and impossible in the same 4 sentences. She folded the letter. So exactly like her. Gideon's mouth moved. "That seems like progress." "It is," Eleanor said. "It's exactly like progress." The last Sunday of November, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window while the first real snow of the season came down outside. Not the angry driving snow of a storm, just the steady, thick, quiet snow that arrives when winter has decided to stay. It covered the yard, the fence lines, the roof of the barn, the long grass of the fields, making everything into the same simplified version of itself, white and clean and quiet. From the yard came sounds. The twins were making something in the snow, arguing about it in the specific twin way, each certain the other was wrong, and both probably right about different parts of it. Sam was standing in the chicken coop doorway, counting his hens with the stern expression of a foreman doing an audit. Will and Henry were carrying wood, their voices low between them, the rhythm of a task done without needing to discuss it. May was helping Gideon fix the latch on the barn door, or rather standing next to him providing unsolicited commentary on his technique, which he was receiving with patient silence. Even from the window, Eleanor could see the quality of his listening. That particular attentiveness he brought to May's presence, still and oriented, like a man who had gotten used to this frequency and didn't mind it anymore. More than didn't mind it. Thomas was on her hip. He was 8 months old and solid and awake and interested in the world with the alert intensity of a person who has recently discovered that the world extends beyond the immediate and is still processing the implications. He watched the snow with enormous eyes, following a flake down until it disappeared into the white below, then finding another one. Eleanor stood there holding her son and watching her family in the snow, and she let herself do the thing she rarely did, the thing that felt too vulnerable to do in the middle of a crisis, which all of the past year had been, one crisis sliding into the next without sufficient gap for reflection. She let herself see it, all of it. Not through the filter of what she still needed to do or protect or fight for, but plain and whole. Clara bent over her accounts book at the table behind her. May talking at the barn door. Henry and Will moving through the yard with the easy confidence of boys who know their place in a working household. The twins squabbling in the snow, meaning they were fed and safe and bored enough to fight about things that didn't matter. Sam and his chickens. Thomas on her hip, watching snow fall like it was the best thing he'd ever seen. And Gideon, who had moved his box of things down the hall and never said a word about it being permanent, because with him, doing the thing meant it was permanent, and saying so would have been redundant. She thought about the woman she'd been in November of last year. Not with pity. She had no patience for pitying her past self, who had done what needed doing under the circumstances she'd had, but with recognition. That woman had been holding herself together with pure force of will, which is not a sustainable material. You can build a lot out of pure force of will, but it doesn't breathe. It doesn't allow for anything to come in from the outside. The winter had broken her open. Not Fitch, not the courthouse, not the fever, though all of those had contributed. The winter had done it. The long sustained cold of 5 months in one place with one person watching her, consistently and without agenda, had done what no amount of personal determination could do on its own. It had reminded her that human beings are not built for pure self-sufficiency, that asking for nothing and accepting nothing is not strength, but a different kind of failure. She had failed at it, eventually. She had allowed herself to be helped. She had allowed the help to become something more than utility. And the world had not ended. Her children were safe, and her dignity was intact, and the person who had helped her was in her barn right now listening to a 6-year-old lecture him about door latches. She did not think this made her lucky. She'd seen too much of the frontier to believe in luck as a reliable mechanism. She thought it made her someone who had stayed long enough in one place and open enough despite everything that when the right thing came, she'd been able to recognize it. That was the only wisdom she had to offer, and she would not have called it wisdom if someone had asked her. She would have called it what it was, a lesson learned the hard way, at considerable cost, which was the only way the frontier ever taught anything worth knowing. Outside, Gideon had fixed the latch. He said something to May. May looked at the latch, apparently assessed it, and gave a nod of approval, which made Eleanor, watching from the window, close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, he was looking toward the house, toward the window, toward her. She raised her hand slightly. He tilted his chin up, the minimal acknowledgement of a man who said the necessary thing and nothing extra, and turned back to the barn. Thomas dropped the spoon he'd been holding. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the floor. He looked back at Eleanor with an expression of total indignation that she was not immediately retrieving it. "I know," she said to him. "That's not fair." She bent and picked up the spoon and gave it back, and he held it for approximately 4 seconds and then dropped it again with evident satisfaction. She picked it up again. She supposed she would be doing this for a while. The snow kept falling outside steady and quiet, covering the hard ground of the Montana plains in white. And inside the ranch house that had been empty and lonely for too long and was now neither, the fire burned and the accounts were being balanced and the bread was rising on the counter, and it was, all of it, imperfect and complicated and real and sufficient, more than sufficient. It was enough to build a life on. And they had. End of part 5. End of story.